We continue to track all of the developments in Japan, including the concerns about the stability of the nuclear reactors in that country. For more on that part of the story, we're joined now by Gordon Edwards. He's president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, and he joins us in Montreal. So, Gordon Edwards, we are hearing talk of a partial meltdown at yet another reactor in Japan. Help us understand, what does partial meltdown actually mean?
Well, it means that the fuel of the reactor, you can extinguish the original fire, the original nuclear fire, but the ashes continue to generate heat. These are called fission products, and they're very, very radioactive, and they generate about 200 megawatts of heat even after the reactor shut down. So they have to keep cooling the reactor for days and days after the shutdown. Otherwise, the temperature will rise and the reactor fuel will start melting at a temperature of about 4,000 to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 2,200 degrees Celsius. And when that happens, you could, that's about double the melting point of steel. So therefore, it'll just melt through the floor of the reactor eventually and right into the ground. The difficulty, of course, is that when this is happening, you have explosions and you have the release of very large quantities of radioactive gases, vapors, and ashes.
Yeah, tell me a bit more about that, because even in the case of a partial meltdown, there is this risk of radioactive leakage. Are we talking at this stage about particles, vapors? I've heard officials talk about cesium. So what exactly are we talking about when we talk about radioactive material leaking out?
Right. Well, there are a couple of dozen of radioactive materials which leak out even before it reaches the melting point. And cesium is one of the worst of these. What happens is that when they come in contact with cold surfaces, whether buildings or skin or internal organs, they adhere, they stick, and they become a part of that. They become incorporated into it. Now, these radioactive atoms, they disintegrate, which means they explode. And when they explode, that's when they damage the cells of the body. Now, even though the Japan authorities say there's no immediate danger, that's not really quite true. There is immediate danger. However, the health concerns may not show up for 15 years. In other words, you may see a flourishing of cancer later on. You won't see it today. And
in your experience, and based on other concerns at other reactors around the world, just in terms of recent nuclear history, when you get into a partial meltdown mode, is it still possible to actually provide a cooling system that stops it from going into full meltdown?
Well, that is exactly the problem, because there is such a thing as what's called an uncoolable geometry. It means that if enough of this melts into a mass which is large enough, then because the heat is being generated internally, you cannot cool it anymore, because when you try and cool it, it only forms a crust on the outside, but the melting continues on the inside. And they're hoping to prevent that. They're hoping that by flooding the reactor with seawater, they can prevent the formation of a blob of molten material, which would be literally uncoolable. Once the uncoolable geometry is met, then you're sunk.
Okay, so what we're hearing from Japanese officials today is they're saying that they've measured the radiation levels outside the afflicted plant, and they consider those levels not to be a health risk. So is it pretty clear to everyone that at a certain level they do pose a health risk, and if so, what is that?
Well, they definitely do pose a health risk. They're playing with words a little bit. You see, there are two levels of radiation exposure. Very high levels cause immediate radiation sickness. Your hair falls out, you vomit, and within days or weeks, you may be dead. That only is caused by high levels of radiation exposure. So when they say there's no health risk, they mean the levels are not at that point. However, the difficulty is that people of all kinds, especially young children and nursing infants and even embryos, are absorbing radioactive materials into their body, which will irradiate them internally for years afterwards, and this causes a long-term health risk, which is quite serious.
And in the short term, we're hearing officials in Japan are suggesting that iodine can help, maybe iodine pills can be taken. What is it about iodine that seems to diminish some of the health risks of radiation?
Actually, iodine has no special properties to counteract radiation at all, except that there's one type of radioactive emission, which is radioactive iodine. And radioactive iodine is taken up avidly by the body and goes to the thyroid gland, And especially in young children, this can have serious effects on their mental development, on their physical development. So what they do is they give iodine pills in an effort to overdose the thyroid with normal, non-radioactive iodine, so that it will be less likely to take up the radioactive iodine. However, there's dozens of other materials for which there's no protection whatsoever.
Obviously troubling news, and we'll follow it all very closely. Gordon Edwards, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for this.
Thank you.